Just like with bad audio, bad editing happens to good podcasters. Welcome back to Your Mic. My name is Freddy Cruz, founder of Speke Podcasting. If you want to chat pods, you want me to edit yours, hit me up, Freddy with a Y at spekepodcasting.com. And bad editing, it's a twofold problem. Okay? On one hand, you've got a podcast host that records something, whether it's on Zoom or Riverside or in person at their favorite podcast studio, and they don't even bother playing it back. They just upload the file. They don't even do what we call trimming the heads and tails, you know, the beginning and the very end. So if you hit record, and maybe it takes about 5 to 10 seconds to actually start the episode, okay? The head, and likewise at the very end, you just thank you for coming to the show, thank you for listening. And then there's 5 seconds of tail, right? And so the heads and the tails don't even get edited, much less the 10 seconds of pregnant pause for no reason, or if the dog is barking in the background. By the way, I actually like it when dogs bark in the background. It's when the Amazon guy comes and maybe he's taking a couple minutes too long to find, to fill out his form or whatever it is they do at your door, and the dog is actually in the same room as you and it's overbearing, and you just power through the podcast episode instead of stopping it. Or maybe you stop the recording of the episode. You keep recording, but you stop the episode, the conversation, and you wait for the dog to start barking. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. Sparrow tends to get like that when people are there. And so you're rolling tape, but in post-production, you leave it in, because there is no post-production. Or maybe you have an emotional moment where the guest is crying. And these things happen. They've happened during our client shows. There's a way to maintain that humanity and that emotion, that rawness, that storytelling component. Silence is golden, just like when you're at the movies. Enjoy the Silence is not just a Depeche Mode song. You want to maintain that silence. You also don't want to keep 30 seconds or 40 seconds or 50 seconds of pausing in case your guest has to regain their composure. You can chop that down and tighten it so that the moment is between 5 and 8 seconds. And you maintain that humanity without risking your listener changing the podcast because they thought that there was something wrong with the episode. And this is something I've covered in previous episodes of Your Mic, and it's something that I've talked about on occasion on my social media channels, is that silence is fantastic. When it's overdone, just like when you're over editing, it can sound really, really bad. Now, speaking of over editing, there are so many AI tools, and I'm a fan of them. I also prefer editing podcast episodes on Pro Tools. I've been doing this for decades. Before I was ever podcasting, I was editing audio on Pro Tools. I love it. I love getting in there and zooming all the way in and deleting a certain word or phrase or making sure that I'm not clipping a tenth of a second of a breath. That's how passionate I am about editing audio. If you're starting out and you're fresh into your podcast journey and you don't have the budget or bandwidth to hire somebody like me with Speke Podcasting, or even a freelancer who you can hire for dirt cheap overseas, you don't want to overdo it. These AI tools are amazing because they can get rid of the silence. They can get rid of filler words like, They can get rid of the ums and the ahs, the ehs, right? But the problem is these tools are not perfect. So what ends up happening is you have breaths getting cut out. You've got half of an staying in your podcast episode if all you're going to do is click the magic edit button or the AI remove filler words and ums button, and it's not perfect. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of perfectly imperfect, but if you're editing an episode and you want it to sound polished, deleting half of an or half of a breath, or editing every single moment of silence and making your show sound robotic, that sounds just as bad as not listening in post. There is something that I remember a friend of mine years ago would talk about, and that is letting an episode breathe. You let it breathe. So if somebody is asking a question of a guest, and I'll give a fictional question-answer exchange. Freddie, at what moment in your life did you realize you're the villain in your own story? It had to have been when I was 16. So you compare that with, Freddie, at what point in your life did you realize you were the villain in your own story? Oh, when I was 16. So you see the difference there. When you allow for that space, you're not just giving your guest the opportunity to sound measured and thoughtful in their response, because especially if they're taking a few seconds to answer your question, you want to honor that because the guest is measured. The guest is deliberately taking time to answer that question and not just, boom, I better give them an answer because, oh, the clock is ticking. Plus, if it's an interview that's supposed to sound like a conversation, but you're editing every single pause that's longer than 2 seconds, it really sounds more like a ping pong instead of an actual chat amongst friends. And I want you to think in terms of hanging out with a buddy, and maybe you're in the car. Two of my favorite people to drive with in the car will be my daughters. At any point while we're talking, there will be pauses, there'll be moments of silence. Now, obviously this is a different context, so when we're in the car, obviously pauses of 30 seconds or silence, moments of silence of longer than 5 minutes, that's acceptable. It's having a consistent back and forth, and back and forth for the entire duration of a 30-minute car trip that probably sounds exhausting. I won't pretend to talk for them, I'm only saying. So think about that when you are going through and sort of DIYing your podcast episode. It also takes a little bit of the pressure off of you. If you are editing your own episodes, you're pressed for time. I hope this episode is giving you a little bit of a green light to back off of the editing a little bit and really only taking out what is absolutely necessary so that you maintain that humanity that was your conversation with your co-host or your guest who you brought on to share their wisdom and their insights. And in terms of bad editing, with hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there and millions of YouTube videos and all this content that is being thrown our way by the nanosecond, there's just no excuse to not take the time to listen back to your episode after you have recorded it and fix the obvious mistakes. Trim the heads and the tails, the beginning and the end. The long, awkward pauses. Not every pause is a long, awkward pause. Give space. If there are a lot of ums and ahs, sure, go ahead, take them out. If you're using a lot of those filler words, then perhaps you should coach yourself into not using them as much and slowing down the rhythm of your speaking. That way you're not having to rely so much on using those filler words. Remember, I talked about when you as a host are asking a question of a guest and allowing for that 3 to 4 seconds, sometimes longer, pause for them to answer the question, you're allowing them to sound measured and deliberate in their answer. Well, it works both ways. And when you take your time, just take that moment and think about what you're going to say, and you exude that authority instead of talking and 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 talking. So bad editing, what do we learn? 2 components. The bad editing in terms of not really editing, and bad editing as in over-editing and doing way too much so that it sounds like a ping pong game and not so much of a conversation. If you have any questions about this, if you like some insights, I love chatting about podcasts. Hit me up, Freddy with a Y at spekepodcasting.com. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Mic.